Gonna get some kale and lettuce from my parents' garden. It's nice to have some time out of the city and visit friends and family for the summer. I think I'll get some basil too. I'm out here gathering a few things for a salad. I've been thinking more about food since a couple conversations I had recently. Not just eating it, but where our food comes from, how it's grown, the land the food is a part of, and how our food systems are a critical part of our civilizational transformation. Ooh, a couple of tomatoes are ready too. And Jake Marquez and Maren Morgan have a lot of thoughts on this. Their multimedia project called Death in the Garden is about agriculture and the complex intersection between myth, civilization, and climate change. I first stumbled upon their podcast when looking for other people exploring the ideas in the novel Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. As you'll hear, they are certainly kindred spirits. And later in the episode, I speak with another kindred spirit, Manny McGill, to learn about regenerative agriculture. Both of these talks are just pieces of a larger conversation. You can find the full conversations in their entirety on our Patreon. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to Human Nature Odyssey, a podcast exploring our species' relationship with the rest of life on Earth. I'm Alex Leff. Well, I'm curious, just even on a personal level, how you guys met, and can I say, as part of this interview, you're dating?
Yeah.
Yes.
So it sounds very juicy to me. I'm curious what the order of operations was in terms of like meeting each other, building a relationship, and then also creating this project, this ongoing, powerful, world-changing project. What came first, and what were the steps?
We actually met online on one of those dating apps because I was like, oh, I'm in town for a few months. Maybe I can, have some fun, meet a cool girl or something. And just like totally hit it off.
We had been having these insane, mind-blowing conversations the whole time that we had known each other. And it just became this sort of thing where we were just like, we should just make a documentary, because Jake had already been doing video work. He had cameras. That's sort of how it began, us really just trying to talk about regenerative agriculture. And then it wasn't until later that then we were introduced to Ishmael and Daniel Quinn. And we were like, oh.
Yeah. I want to flip this question on you to, get your trajectory into all this too. Because when I had met Maren, I met
myself on a dating app too, so.
So same.
Same story. So Death in the Garden is a podcast, but it's also a film, and you guys are coming at it from so many different angles. What do you see as the connective tissue that makes Death in the Garden, and what has been your vision with it?
Great. Yeah, great question. For me, in short, Death in the Garden is trying to get at modern societies, modern civilizations' relationship with death, and therefore our relationship to the living world and to the rest of life. I had a lot of death anxiety and trying to evade death with dietary choices and lifestyle choices, and realizing that there was no way to live on Earth as a human without having death involved in my own existence. And through that kind of anxiety and that tension point, I began to look and read and research and look for experiences to help me resolve or understand that very human existential anxiety. Hence why I wanted to call the project Death in the Garden, at least my meaning for the death in the garden, the Garden of Eden that is Earth.
Yeah, really the thread that began this whole thing was just this quest of trying to understand why, as far as we're aware, we're the only animal who has this like conscious awareness of our mortality. And there's something about that makes us distinct, not separate, but distinct from the rest of life. And so as we were going on this journey, we began with this sort of idea of like, there's no such thing as a death-free diet. You can't escape the death that's required for you to be alive. That's just how life works. Life is eating life all the time, and death is inextricable from it. You can't have one without the other. And so, there's like a tension there that I think is really uncomfortable for human beings. And as we started this project, we started to notice that there was other ways that this sort of death-denying point of view was coming into play. For instance, for me, a lot of death in the garden was related to also what kind of death is required for life to grow. And in a lot of ways, it may be the death of this mode of civilization, for the very reason that industrial civilization is one of the most destructive forces on Earth, if not the most destructive force on Earth. But what we were noticing is that when we were interacting with people who are trying to save the world and, answering that question of like, do you have an earnest desire to save the world? A lot of people will say yes and go work for green energy companies, or they'll go vegan or something like that. And the intention there is really noble and valid. But when you pull back far enough, you start to realize that, okay, so in order for us to make all of these solar panels to quote unquote save the world, we have to go destroy an entire landscape just to get the raw materials.
To get the rare minerals and all sorts of stuff that goes into making solar panels and the infrastructure that's required to set them up.
Exactly. And so, we just started to notice this sort of, I don't know if I want to say hypocrisy, but it's because it's not really hypocrisy necessarily. It's more just a lack of depth or like an obfuscation or an abstraction. Well, I can view myself as noble by doing this thing, by buying this electric car, by doing these things, but ignore all of the stuff that I don't see, which is all of the other death that I'm doing to try to avoid the death of the world. And so that just became a really, really interesting thread for us, trying to make sense of how could this be? How could we be so aware of the destruction that industrial civilization is having upon the planet without recognizing that many of our attempts to save it are just adjusting industrial civilization slightly? Right. And so that's sort of, I think, what led us into wanting to talk to all of these different people and wanting to sort of build this understanding that can maybe be somehow condensed into some sort of school of thought. I guess that's kind of a long and veiny way of describing it.
No, that's great. That's what we're here for. And I think what's so interesting, our culture tends to have this simplistic idea of like life good, death bad. And ironically, that mindset, in order to avoid death, has created so much of it. What's complex and hard to parse out is like, so we're talking about death is a part of life. It's a beautiful thing. And that's something that the three of us all agree on. I'm sure everyone listening to this can understand as well, abstractly, even if we're terrified of experiencing it or don't want our loved ones to experience, etc. But the irony is, those of us who see death as a part of life are also the most concerned with the death of so much around us and the death of life. And the people that are trying to prolong life as much as possible, that death of themselves, like they want humans to just live forever and they don't want any human to ever die, are perpetuating, the mass extinction of, not that those people individually are perpetuating the individual mass extinction. We're all part of this shebang. But yeah, I just find that so ironic that there's this paradox of wanting life at all costs causes so much death.
Yeah. It's like the wanting to not play by nature's rules. There are the laws of the universe, and the problem comes when we think that we can be not subject to those laws and that we're above them and that we can control them and we can change those laws. That's when the chaos and destruction happens. And those rules, whether we like it or not, require death. The death of everything. Stars eat other stars. Stars collapse and die. Everything dies, and entropy and death is a facet of the universe that isn't going anywhere ever. And the quicker we can come to terms with that, the sooner we can actually bring the balance on the earth I think we're all looking for. But I think that's kind of the thing people struggle with, especially if you're environmentally minded or if you're a young person who is so sensitive to seeing destruction of the world, is that kind of balancing act you have to walk. For us to have this beauty in this life, there is the death that's required for that. And that's one of the hardest things I think for humans to understand and to incorporate, because we are these conscious beings, because we are so incredibly aware of our predicament on earth. It's so hard to be able to accept the death that's required for life.
I think that sort of idea that if death exists and it's evil to us, then we have to figure out how to control that. From that point of view, it's like I can understand through this sort of rationality, through this feeling, this fear of death, that we decided that the best way that we can solve a problem like climate change is to continue to try to control it, to continue to try to order and manage and systematize the living world in order for us to save the world, rather than letting certain things die off, or things die, like just things die in general, letting ourselves die, being okay with that, being okay with, and I'm not the type of person who thinks that like humans are a virus and that we just need to be exterminated. Like I'm not a misanthropist at all. But there is a level of that where it's like we have to be willing to just be a part of life again. And that requires that we're part of living systems, and living systems die and are reborn and regenerate. And it's just this process that we all have to be a part of.
Mm-hmm. I was really taken by, I think it was your first episode. You both were reflecting on, you were on a ranch and they had just killed a bison and were using every part of it as food and for resources. And you were both just reflecting on, putting your money where your mouth is in terms of really having to see like this is very real and it is very unpleasant and it's emotional. Seeing death on that visceral level. After high school, I took a gap year and I was woofing on different small farms, which is like this program. Have you guys
I'm aware of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like there's small farms, usually organic farms, that you get to stay for room and board and work. And I was on this farm in the Pacific Northwest and they had a flock of sheep and they brought these folks out similar to how the bison was killed, where you guys were, where they kill the sheep in the field where it's with its family and it's very quick. The sheep doesn't know it's coming and it's on the land that they grew up in. And Katine, the woman who runs the farm, was like crying when they were doing this. And she was saying, if I ever find myself not breaking down and fully feeling this when I'm taking the life of one of these creatures that I helped raise, then like I don't want to do this anymore. And, compare that to factory farming. It's just such a profoundly different way to exist with it. And it's also a profoundly different way to exist with it than how, veganism and vegetarianism usually thinks of it. Not that those kinds of diets and ways of life are a problem by any means, but like you guys talk about it, I thought was really profound in terms of just having to really accept and get face to face with this reality that we're all a part of.
Yeah, and that experience was the first time that we had seen death. We've seen a lot, and I actually killed a sheep in Sweden. And, interestingly, like every single one of the shepherds that are our friends there, they were all former vegans. And then they realized that there was something missing with their connectedness to life that they weren't achieving through their vegan diet. And, for me, that was a really like insane experience, because the night before I was supposed to kill this sheep, I got the call from my mom that my grandma was dying. And I'm like 35 hours away. And, and so it's like, okay, well, Marin, should you not do this, or do you want to do this? And it was just this thing where it's like, I have to do this. This is the right time. This is the right thing to do. It was a sheep who was 8 years old, a ewe who her teeth were going to start to fall out soon, and she hadn't lambed in a while. And when I did kill the sheep, and we're, it's surrounded by its flock in this beautiful landscape that is just like so nourished by these sheep. I mean, the Fielbetta is like one of the coolest places on earth. I just had this profound sense as like the sheep's soul just spread through the flock. And it was just like this feeling of there's nothing wrong with this. And finally, you're putting your money where your mouth is. And finally, you understand what it costs to be alive on earth. It was just this profound sense of growing up. And then, to like lose my grandmother, who was my everything as a child. That was trial by fire as far as you're growing up now. This is your initiation into life. And the main thing that I walked away with was just this profound devastation that not every being dies as mercifully and quickly as that you did. Knowing that all around the world, factory farms exist, And it's really hard to know that no matter how high quality your meat is, they're not dying in that way most of the time, in part because of the way that our laws are structured around this type of thing. But it definitely motivated me to be like, okay, well, shit. Part of the reason why I'm here on Earth is to make it so that when animals die, they die like this.
Well, and if I can add on to this, when you begin to understand and experience the death that's required for you to live, whether that is from an animal food or even a plant food, it changes the way, it makes you a lot more responsible. When you witness an animal die, or if you go and see the landscapes upon which soy is grown, there's death in both things, and it makes it really hard to see food differently. Whether I'm eating some grains or whether I'm eating a piece of meat, I know what that looks like. And we're lucky enough to get meat from really good sources, but I have a really hard time eating meat from any other way because I know it makes you more responsible. It changes the way I behave in my day-to-day life when I know firsthand. And I have a hard time with a lot of like grains and plant foods because I've seen the eviscerated landscapes so that I could have this grain or this plant food or this strawberry. When you accept and you encounter and get as close to that death that's required for you to live, it makes you a lot more responsible, and it makes the lines of which foods or which behavior patterns are good or bad for the planet a lot more blurry, and it makes you want to get closer and closer to the landscape, and it makes you want to get a lot more responsible about where your food comes from because you know what's at its cost. And watching Marin kill that sheep and watching bison be killed and watching cows be killed, it's like, wow, I need to be way more responsible for my life because every bite of food I've ever had in my life, there was a huge amount of sacrifice from a landscape, from an animal, from an ecosystem so that I could live. On both sides of the spectrum of people who don't care where their food comes from or people who think that their plant-based vegan diets are the best thing to happen to the planet, quite often we find that there is that lack of awareness and responsibility for where their lives come from.
And I mean, ironically, it's like you'd think that eating food, that's such a survival thing. You'd think that that's kind of the bare necessity. But in a sense, in our modern culture, that's the luxury to even think about that. The people that are really just surviving will have to take food wherever they can possibly get it. It's an amazing thing for those of us who are able to appreciate this privilege that we have to get to think about these things and then try to help change the system so other people can have easier access to it. Just thinking about folks who grow up in food deserts, which meaning they only have access to fast food, only access to processed foods. There's no way. I often think about this in the grocery store, when there's the apple that's $1 and it's just called an apple. And then there's an organic apple and it's $2. It's like, wait a second. I'm paying more so you don't put chemicals and poison on this apple. It's like it feels like a thug came up to me in an alleyway. He's like, all right, dude, give me $1. I'm going to poison on your food. It's like, what the hell are you holding me hostage with this? It's just wild that our system is set up where the base level of food that people are interacting with, the cheapest, most affordable food that's most available, is the least healthy and based on the most destructive practices.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I don't want to sound at all like, because you're absolutely right. Most people we heard somebody describe it as also as a food apartheid. That is the case for most people on Earth. And again, this is why food is such a nexus of, it is the key to civilization. And it is the key and the foundation of how this destructive civilization is built. And I think that's what you're describing is so many people don't have a choice. Marin and I barely have a choice. So many of the privileged barely even have a choice of the quality of food because we've destroyed the planet to such a degree and polluted it to such a degree. And very few of us have that privilege to begin to choose how we interact with our food. But our food is the most powerful way to interact with the living world because that's the nexus of life and death for us. That's how you interact.
Yeah. And that idea also presupposes that food is meant to be a product that you can get profits off of. And, we've had a really interesting look into the food system. We have these food barons that are incredibly wealthy, these massive conglomerations that wield an outsized amount of power. And one of the best ways that we could get outside of that is to stop participating in it and to start participating with local farms. The problem with local farms is that in order for them to compete with these big scale conglomerates, is they have to raise their prices. And so there needs to be some sort of lever that balances things out where it's actually more affordable to go to the small farm that's in your local community. And actually what we found is that it's kind of the truth. Where we go to the farmer's market, the beef is the same amount as it is at the grocery store from a conventional farm. But a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people do think that these are sort of like luxury beliefs. And in a sense, they are. For instance, if you live on the East Coast and you're buying a $30 chicken from Polyface Farms, it's like, I don't really know who that helps, other than people wanting to also pat themselves on the back and say that they did a good job. So there's a lot of complexity to it. Getting into these sorts of conversations has just really shown us that we really need to think about how can we make this sort of thing accessible to people. And a lot of that is like people coming in and changing the farm bill and changing legislation, making sure that these types of foods are subsidized too, potentially, because they're not. And that's why they're unaffordable. There's a lot of politics. We spoke to a farmer and he was just like, hunger is political. That's just a fact. And Daniel Quinn talks about this as well. But yeah, so it's really hard to talk about because obviously we're outsiders, but we see so much potential in these different ways of doing agriculture. And we see the way that the civilization just wants to like stamp it out and make it not exist. And then we also see the ways that this type of agriculture is acquiescing to the civilizational story in order for them to survive. And you can't blame them, but it just always comes back to this thing for us. Okay, but then how do we actually move forward? How do we actually make changes if we just constantly are deferring to this baseline that we all know is toxic to the planet and toxic to ourselves? And so it's really complicated. It's a really difficult position to be in.
So Jake and Marin mentioned their first focus was on regenerative agriculture, which is something I wanted to learn more about. So I spoke with Mandy McGill from Colorado. Mandy is an educator, consultant, and founder of the Earth Regeneration Alliance. Okay, here's an excerpt of my conversation with Mandy. When I was a little kid, when I was 2 or 3, the first thing I wanted to be in the world was a farmer. I loved the idea how all my toys were of a bunch of different animals, and I would get like little toy barns and stuff. And my mom was really supportive of it, so we would go to the local farms and I get to help with the chores. And then we found this farm in central Pennsylvania where you could do these guest stays, and we would stay for a weekend. And we would return to this farm year after year with this family. They became really close with us, and over the summers I would stay with them. And I think what I was enjoying was it's a way to be in nature and actually really engage with it, and it feels like I'm here to take care of it. And then also getting older and seeing that the reality of conventional modern farming is actually often about controlling nature and manipulating nature for a profit. And it's less about taking care of the animals on these big factory farms. It's about just using them like they're commodities. But there's many cultures that are able to farm in different ways that are not at odds with the natural world, but actually a part of it. And my understanding is regenerative agriculture is this term that's essentially trying to name what that kind of farming is. Daniel Quinn, in some of his later books, uses the term to specify the other form of farming is totalitarian agriculture. And that's the kind of agriculture that, like we're saying, is monoculture, would pump chemicals into the ground, is just trying to get as much profit as possible, and is viewing nature as a commodity. And so, in contrast to that, how would you describe what regenerative agriculture is?
Yeah, and I want to say it's no one's fault that we're here. I went through a phase where I was like, why don't farmers and ranchers just change how they're doing things? And it's like, we are all stuck in a system that is keeping us on this path, whether you eat food or whether you produce it or whatever. And so I think that's an important thing to realize, like especially post-World War II, that things got really funneled into this very industrial way of being. And it was the Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, back in the 70s or 80s, The big quotes back then were get big or get out and plant fence row to fence row. So it was, when you think about that, then you start to realize why farmers and ranchers have to use antibiotics or spray pesticides or synthetic fertilizers or whatever, because we are actively going against the way nature would do something. We're going against biodiversity and all those things. That is exactly how nature would function. And so we have to keep implementing these things that mean that we can, quote unquote, control it. Another thing to point out as well, I got this from Kiss the Ground, which is an amazing nonprofit in this whole space. They talk about degenerative, sustainable, and regenerative. And degenerative is like current agriculture. It's degenerating the soil, it's degenerating water supplies, all of the things, right? And then we went into this whole space of like, oh, we need sustainable XYZ. Well, we've degenerated so much to the point now that it's like, is that what we want to sustain? So that's why regenerative is such an important term, because it starts to shift that mindset.
If you had to describe the philosophy of regenerative agriculture, how would you try to put it into words?
Oh gosh, I guess maybe the simplest would be, are you giving back more than you take? I think it was The Third Plate by Dan Barber. It was over in Spain, and I want to say it was an olive grove. And I remember him saying, yeah, about 50% get eaten by birds. And he said, but that makes total sense to me because they're here too. You know, so I think it's kind of this idea of like, it's not ours. We are part of something. And so I think one of the most profound ways we can think about that is, for example, when you see a deer crossing a road, is the deer crossing a road or is the road crossing a forest? And so when you see it like that changes everything. And I feel like, especially, I mean, right now, the term regenerative is getting a lot of traction. And I feel, at first I was annoyed about that. It was like, wait, when we define it, we've now completely gone against what it is, because the whole idea is that it is emergent and evolving and has potential that we cannot define and we cannot put limits on. And yet the reason that I am okay with this right now is that we do need that. The majority of people are so disconnected that we actually need some prompts. I'm calling them guide rails instead of guardrails. I'm calling them guide rails. And I feel that we do need that just to even have the language around what it is that we're even trying to feel. Regenerative is not new. That is indigenous wisdom. That is nature. That is thinking as nature. And one of the best ways, I think, to explain regenerative is the connection of ruminant animals, cattle, elk, bison, deer, goats, sheep, their connection with grasslands. This is holistic plant grazing, which is from Savory Institute, and it's Alan Savory. It's an amazing organization. They're based in Boulder, but they've got global hubs. And so he went through a whole process throughout his whole life of trying to figure these things out, especially grasslands, because grasslands, if you think about that in terms of ruminant animals, North America is a great place to look because we used to have millions of bison running across the plains, and they would be very compacted as far as herd effect on the land, and they would be continually moving. They wouldn't stay in one place. And it's the predator-prey relationship. You know, it'd be wolves that were coming up on them and they would be moving and trying to protect themselves. So I think holistic plant grazing is a really great way to kind of tie into how nature co-evolved, because grasslands specifically co-evolved with these animals because grasslands are not in humid areas. You know, the tropics did not co-evolve with ruminant animals, but grassland areas did. So when you have perennial humidity, then that area can regenerate without animal impact. But when you're in a more arid area that gets like maybe monsoonal rains, that kind of thing, and you're dry a lot of the year, the moisture content and nutrient cycling that the land needs is actually in the guts of those animals. They're like a walking rainforest or a walking compost machine. When I see a grassland without animals on it moving the way nature would have them move, it makes me sad because I know that that grassland actually needs them. And vice versa. So when you have the kind of impact that comes from how nature would have these animals move, the way their hooves break the soil crust allows water infiltration, but it's not deep tilling, right? It's just breaking up this, it's like disturbance on the land. Also, just the urine and dung and all of that creates that fertilization. And so it creates this really beautiful symphony that happens in the soil, and it builds out soil organic matter. The way their mouths tear at the grasses actually spur growth. And when they're not in one place for too long, they have a regenerating impact, which is how that coevolution happened. But when you have animals that are all over the land all the time, not being moved in kind of this predator-prey relationship kind of format, then they can actually overgraze plants, which begins to desertify that land. And so you can either have no animals on a more arid area, like a arid grassland area, or you could have animals in a way that they're not meant to be on that land, and both of those desertify land. So it's the way that animals have been moved and that disconnection from how they would naturally move with that land that has created, desertification, and which means that you're really turning it into a desert.
So the Savory Institute, Mandy mentioned, is an organization that Jake and Marin are involved with too. And through the Savory Institute's website, I've been learning a lot more about holistic management grazing, which is a regenerative ranching practice which helps move hooved animals like cattle, sheep, goats through landscapes the way large herds naturally co-evolved with grasslands. It reflects how ecosystems evolved to naturally regenerate over time. Well, so many of us now live in cities so far away from food systems. I'm one of those people, even though, I wanted to be a farmer ever since I was 2. I feel very removed from the systems that actually create the food that I'm taking in. And I think that's the case for lots of people.
Yes. If you think about cities and concentrated animal feeding operations, so feedlots, technically cities are also CAFOs because it's like we're exporting waste and we're bringing in food.
Cities are factory farms for humans.
Exactly. And look at how sick everyone is. So many people are dealing with chronic health issues or allergies or autoimmune diseases, all of these things.
That's something I wanted to ask you about because I think for lots of us in cities, we can't change the way we're growing food because we're not growing food, but we can change the food that we're eating if possible. Some of us have the privilege to. And so that usually shows up as vegetarianism or veganism. Those are the ways that we can interact with our food. And what I've picked up on from the regenerative movement is that it sees veganism not necessarily as the end-all, be-all. I'm curious on your thoughts on that. How does veganism as a diet and a philosophy fit in or clash with the regenerative perspective?
Ooh, it's definitely part of it. But it depends on how people understand where their food is coming from and if it's actually accomplishing, like how their food is being sourced. Is that actually accomplishing what their intrinsic desire is? Because is something like, Beyond Meat or Impossible Burger or whatever, is that in relationship with the land the way we are thinking that we would want it to be? Basically, it's industrial veganism at this point. It's like you're eating food that was industrially harvested, and it doesn't matter to me what you eat. Like, that's really not what matters. It matters where it comes from. It matters how it was grown, how it was raised, how it went into death. And that is something we are so disconnected from. People don't even know about these things anymore. So whether or not you eat a regenerative local meat burger or you eat a regenerative local veggie burger, both of those are helping to draw down that legacy load of carbon in the atmosphere, which is also helping to unburden the oceans. But when you're in a city, how do you source that way? Because ultimately, if tomorrow everyone woke up and said, I'm going to source locally and regeneratively, you can't. We don't have enough of it. It is very few and far between.
The infrastructure's not there. Yeah.
We're going to have to go through a large transition because it is a transition. This is not something that can happen overnight. We cannot just stop using fossil fuels or stop with the industrial food system right away. We've got to figure out how to transition. We can be regenerative. Humans are not by nature degenerative. We just have become disconnected, right?
What?
Yeah. What? What are you saying?
Well, it's funny because probably like 20 years ago, there was this comic strip in the newspaper. I remember my parents had it at the table. And what's the name of that comic with a penguin? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Ooh,
Opie?
Yeah.
Something like that. What Opie?
Yeah,
I don't know what the heck his name was. I'm sure people listening to this are like, you idiot, his name was Frank. But I remember, and I don't know why this has stuck with me. This penguin, was very concerned with his environmental impact. And he was essentially living, he was in our society, he was living amongst humans.
Yeah.
And he wanted to go green, and he wanted to reduce, reuse, recycle. All the big words that were, in the 2000s were really becoming mainstream. And he just kept noticing that, like, everything he was doing was, he didn't use the language, but degenerating. It was just taking from the environment. It's like, we can recycle, we can use less water, we can change the light bulbs, but like, I'm still just taking. It's just like, I'm taking a little less. And he really sincerely wanted to not just constantly keep taking from the earth. He didn't want to have an impact. And over the course of, a few days, the comic strip's evolving, and you're seeing various ways he's trying to implement this, until finally the finale is he has himself tied up by the hands and arms, and he's like strung up in his room so he won't even like touch the ground. And the joke is that I'm just going to not exist. How do I? Because taking up space on this planet, if we care about it, seems like it's just going to constantly take away from everything. And the idea that our presence being here could actually help, actually be part of the ecosystem, and start to actually implement practices that are regenerating what we've degraded is pretty profound. Thank you to Mandy McGill for joining us today. To learn more about the work Mandy is doing in her home state of Colorado, as well as some educational resources on regenerative agriculture, make sure to check out our show notes. And thank you to Jake and Maren for joining us as well. I highly recommend you check out their podcast or Substack, Death in the Garden, to hear more from them. And consider joining us on Patreon. There you'll find the full conversations with Jake, Maren, and Mandy, and a bunch of other extras. Your support makes this podcast possible. As always, our theme music is Celestial Soda Pop by Lynch. You can find a link in our show notes. And before we go, I wanted to share one last thing from the talk with Jake and Maren. I'm curious with you guys with Death in the Garden and your work, what do you see as the thing that you're trying to most pass on?
I think that if there's anything that I'm trying to say is that there's a reason that we're born at this time, and that we all have a purpose. We all have a role to play in this ecosystem, and that life does have meaning, because I think that's the thing that has like permeated my childhood the most, was this sense of meaninglessness of all of it. I think that there's a lot of despair in our generations and the younger generations. And so I think that more than anything is, it's like, you have a role to play here, and life can be meaningful, but you have to choose it too. You have to choose to be a part of life.
Talk with you soon.